Something uncomfortable sits at the foundation of Islam, something rarely spoken, rarely questioned, but impossible to ignore once you notice it. Because long before the Quran, long before Muhammad, long before the idea of one God, Arabia was a world of idols, rituals, sacred stones, tribal gods, lunar deities. And the strange part? Many of those ancient practices didn't disappear. They were absorbed, transformed, rebranded. Islam didn't rise out of a spiritual vacuum. It rose out of a culture already overflowing with religion, and much of that old religion survived inside the new one. And once you start tracing the roots, the story gets complicated. This is Islam has a pagan roots problem, and to understand how deep it goes, we have to start at the beginning, the God before God. Here's the part most people never learn, the part that slips quietly through history, even though it changes everything once you actually hear it. Allah existed long before Islam ever appeared. He was not introduced as a fresh revelation or a brand new divine presence. He was already there, already worshipped, already understood as a familiar figure in the spiritual landscape of Arabia. And he was not the only God. In fact, he was one among many, the senior figure in a crowded pantheon that filled the region with shrines, idols, and sacred names. People saw him the way ancient Greeks saw Zeus, as a powerful father standing at the top of a family of gods, each with its own role, its own tribe, its own mythology. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. When Islam arrived, it did not claim to find an empty desert of belief. It arrived in a world that already believed in countless divine beings. Yet, instead of rejecting that world entirely, something else happened. Allah was not introduced. He was inherited. He was not discovered. He was selected. Islam declared that this particular God, already known and already loved by many, was the only one allowed to remain. Every other deity was erased. Their names were condemned. Their stories were rewritten. Their shrines were destroyed. But Allah stayed. His name stayed. His identity stayed. The idea of a supreme God stayed. The past did not vanish. It simply shifted shape. This is why historians do not call it a rupture. They call it continuity. A cultural thread that survived through transformation rather than annihilation. And once you see that, once you realize that the so-called one true God began as one choice among many, you start to feel a subtle shift inside yourself. You begin to wonder how much of faith is truly divine and how much is simply inherited from the people who came before, carrying their beliefs across generations without ever questioning where those beliefs were born. The black stone that outlived 300 idols. The Kaaba, the center of Islamic worship today, did not begin its story inside Islam. It stood long before the first verse of the Quran was ever recited. For centuries, it was the spiritual heart of Arabia, a gathering point where tribes came together not under one faith, but under many. Inside its walls stood 360 idols, each representing a different tribe and a different god. Every group had its symbol, its story, its reason to return. People circled the Kaaba in devotion long before Muhammad was born. They prayed aloud. They chanted. They touched the stones the way people touch relics today, believing they carried power, luck, and protection. The movements, the rhythm, the emotion of the ritual would feel strangely familiar to any modern pilgrim. Then Islam arrived, and with it came a promise to purify the sacred space. The idols were broken and discarded. The pantheon was erased. Yet something important happened alongside the destruction. The Kaaba itself was not rejected. It remained. The pilgrimage remained. The act of circling the shrine remained. And the most curious element of all, the black stone, stayed exactly where it had always been. People kept touching it, kissing it, treating it as a channel to something beyond the physical world. That behavior did not start with Islam. It simply continued through a new lens. Think about what that means. A faith that prides itself on rejecting the pagan world kept the pagan object at its center. A stone worshippers once approached with offerings now draws millions of Muslims who believe it holds unique spiritual value. The form changed, but the instinct stayed. So a question naturally rises. If the idols were removed but the shrine stayed, if the names were changed but the rituals continued, if the black stone survived every revolution of belief, then what exactly was purified? Was paganism defeated, or did it simply get repainted in the colors of a new religion? The moon above Mecca. Here is where the story begins to feel even more uncomfortable, because the sky above Mecca holds a clue many people never stop to consider. Long before Islam, many Arab tribes looked to the moon as a divine presence. Lunar gods and goddesses shaped their rituals, their calendars, and their understanding of sacred time. The night sky was not just beautiful, it was holy. And the crescent shape that so many people now associate exclusively with Islam was already carved into the spiritual identity of Arabia thousands of years earlier. It was painted on temples, etched into stones, and used as a marker of divine cycles. Now look at what remains today. The Islamic calendar is entirely lunar. Every holy month rises and falls with the movement of the moon. Ramadan begins when a thin silver arc appears in the sky. Eid is confirmed when that arc returns. Even the start of each day is measured by darkness rather than sunrise. And beyond the calendar, the crescent symbol itself has become one of the most recognizable emblems of Islam, sitting atop mosques, printed on flags, engraved into jewelry, and used to represent the faith across the world. When you see a religion insist that it is pure, untouched, free of older influences, yet its symbols and sacred rhythms match the practices of a pre-existing lunar tradition, something begins to shift in your perception. You do not feel hostility, you feel clarity. You begin to understand a truth that historians often repeat with quiet certainty. Belief systems do not fall from the sky complete and original. They grow from the soil beneath them. They inherit the symbols of the land. They reshape the rituals people already understand. They evolve piece by piece until the past becomes invisible, even though it never truly disappears. Once you recognize that pattern, the moon above Mecca looks less like a unique revelation and more like a surviving echo of the world that came before. Hajj, a pilgrimage older than Islam. Millions of Muslims circle the Kaaba every year with a sense of deep certainty. They believe they are retracing the footsteps of Abraham, repeating an ancient, monotheistic journey carved into sacred history. It feels timeless. It feels original. It feels divinely authored. But when you look at the history of Arabia before Islam, an entirely different picture appears. Every major movement of the Hajj, every gesture that seems uniquely Islamic today, already existed in the rituals of pagan Arabia. People walked around the Kaaba in devotion long before Islam. They moved between the two hills of Safa and Marwa as part of older mythic traditions. They hurled stones at pillars to ward off spirits and bad omens. They drank water from the Zamzam well because it was believed to carry supernatural blessing. They shaved their heads as a symbolic cleansing of the soul. None of these practices were invented by Islam. They were inherited, and instead of being discarded, they were repurposed and woven into new narratives. Their original meanings were stripped away and replaced with stories about Abraham and Ishmael, stories that retroactively claimed ownership over rituals that had been part of Arabian culture for generations. It is as if the past had to be rewritten in order to legitimize the present. What was once pagan became rebranded as prophetic. What was once tribal became recast as universal. When you notice this pattern, something inside you shifts. You begin to see that the continuity is not accidental. It reveals how religions often grow by rewriting what people already know, rather than by creating entirely new practices. And once you see that the pilgrimage of Islam rests upon the footsteps of forgotten gods and forgotten myths, you cannot unsee it. The rituals remain the same, only the explanation changed. When a religion rebrands its mythology, nearly every major religion we know today carries the fingerprints of something older. It is one of the quiet truths of history, a truth most believers never study because it complicates the idea of divine originality. Christianity did not emerge on an empty stage. It absorbed Roman holidays, Roman festivals, even Roman symbols, because people rarely abandoned their traditions outright. Judaism did the same with the mythology of the Canaanites, adopting their stories, their laws, and their cosmic structure, then reframing them as revelations from a single god. Buddhism carried forward vast pieces of Hindu cosmology, from reincarnation to karma, to the very structure of the universe. And Islam followed this same path. It absorbed the spiritual world of Arabia. The gods of the region were removed in name, yet survived indirectly through the stories that replaced them. The rituals remained, reshaped to suit the new theology. The sacred geography stayed exactly where it had always been. Mecca and its shrines were not chosen randomly. They were chosen because people already considered them holy. A religion does not rise by telling people to give up everything they know. It rises by reshaping what they know, by bending familiar practices into new interpretations. This is not an attack. It is a pattern repeated across civilizations. When leaders want a message to spread, they do not fight culture. They merge with it. They adapt its rhythms. They retell its myths in new ways so that the transition feels natural rather than threatening. And once you look at Islam through that lens, once you see how comfortably it fits into the spiritual landscape that existed before it, the story begins to shift. What once looked like a sudden burst of divine revelation begins to resemble something else entirely. It starts looking like strategic assimilation, a thoughtful remolding of older beliefs into a new and compelling narrative that people could accept without losing themselves completely. The politics of pure monotheism. Islam presents itself as the clean return to a forgotten truth, the restoration of the pure monotheism of Abraham. It is a powerful idea. It gives the faith a sense of ancient authority, a sense that it bypassed every flawed tradition in between and went straight back to the beginning. But purity is not a historical fact. Purity is a narrative. A story told to give a religion the feeling of perfect continuity with the past. It works like a branding strategy. It simplifies the messy reality of history into a single, elegant message. When you look more closely at how Islam formed, the picture changes. The religion did not strip Arabia of its previous beliefs. It did something far more subtle. It curated them. Instead of clearing the cultural slate entirely, it kept the practices people already loved and reshaped them in ways that felt familiar, yet newly meaningful. The rituals remained because rituals bind communities. They give people rhythm and memory and identity. The sacred locations remained because people were already emotionally attached to them. The stories remained, but their endings were rewritten to fit a new theological frame. In this way, the past was not rejected, it was edited. And this editing was not accidental. It was a method of survival. A religion cannot spread if it demands that people abandon every aspect of their former world. Most believers do not change through total rupture. They change through transition. By allowing familiar structures to stay in place, Islam made itself accessible. It looked like revelation while feeling like home. This is how religions endure. Not by wiping away culture, but by absorbing it, smoothing its edges, reimagining it in new language. What is called purity is often just continuity dressed in divine authority. And once you understand this, you see that Islam's strength did not come from rejecting the world around it. It came from rewriting that world in its own voice. The uncomfortable truth about revelation. If a religion builds itself on older structures, symbols, and rituals, does that automatically disprove it? Not necessarily. People all over the world find meaning in stories that have ancient roots. But noticing these roots does reveal something that believers are often trained to overlook. Revelation is never as pure as it claims to be. It does not arrive in isolation. It does not descend from the heavens untouched by the world that receives it. Even the most passionately defended doctrines are shaped not only by divine claims but by the culture, politics, and traditions surrounding them. Every revelation begins in a particular time and place. It takes on the language of its people. It uses metaphors they already understand. It borrows symbols that hold emotional power. It reshapes familiar rituals to give them new meaning. When you recognize this, revelation starts to look less like an otherworldly interruption and more like a continuation of the human story. A story filtered through memory, through collective habits, through the expectations of the society where it appears. Islam is no exception. It speaks the vocabulary of Arabia. It reflects the landscape of its birthplace. It adopts the spiritual architecture that existed long before the Quran. And when you acknowledge that, the central question begins to shift. You no longer ask whether revelation happened in a vacuum. You begin to ask how much of it was assembled from pieces that already existed. Was Islam unveiling something entirely new, a truth untouched by earlier traditions? Or was it reorganizing the spiritual world that surrounded it, stitching together familiar elements into a structure that appeared new because it carried a different message. This is not about cynicism. It is about clarity. Once you see the deep continuity beneath the surface, revelation becomes less mysterious but far more human. The myth of the final religion. Islam describes itself as the last stop in the long story of revelation, the final message delivered to humanity, a kind of spiritual conclusion that perfects everything that came before it. It is a powerful claim because it gives the faith a sense of closure, as if all questions have already been answered and nothing new can ever surpass it. But history does not move in clean endings. It does not wrap beliefs into neat chapters and declare them complete. History builds in layers. Traditions rise, merge, reshape one another, and carry traces of the past into every new generation. Religions do not end each other the way books end their final pages. They overlap across centuries. They borrow stories, symbols, and rituals. They evolve through contact with other cultures. They absorb ideas and recycle them into new narratives. When you view the world this way, the idea of a single final truth becomes deeply complicated. It only makes sense if you ignore the foundation beneath Islam, the one built by the people and spiritual systems that came long before it. Once you look under the surface, you find something harder to reconcile. You find structures that were already in place. You find rituals practiced for centuries before the Quran. You find symbols that predate Islam by thousands of years. You find myths that were reinterpreted and given new names. It becomes clear that what is called the final revelation was constructed from pieces shaped by countless older hands. The past was not discarded, it was reassembled. And when you see that, the idea of finality begins to feel less like a divine truth and more like a claim meant to seal authority, not an ending, but another layer on top of a much older story. What fear tried to hide. So why is none of this taught? Why do most believers grow up with the idea that Islam arrived as a clean break from the past, rather than an evolution of it? The answer is simpler and more human than people expect. Acknowledging continuity threatens authority. If Islam is partly constructed from older traditions, if its rituals and symbols are inherited rather than revealed, then the claim of divine uniqueness begins to crack. And when that claim cracks, everything built on it becomes unstable. A religion that insists it is absolutely original cannot afford to admit that it carries the DNA of the world that existed before it. Because the moment people recognize that older beliefs shape their current faith, obedience weakens, control slips, fear loses its power. When a system depends heavily on the idea that questioning is dangerous, even a small crack can feel like an earthquake. No religion wants to confess that it is more of a remix than a revelation. Yet the evidence does not disappear just because words deny it. You can see it in the rituals Muslims perform every year. You see it in the circling of the Kaaba. You see it in the act of touching a stone that predates the faith itself. You see it in the walking paths of Hajj that were used by pagans long before Islam. You see it in the lunar symbols that top every mosque. These elements survived because they were too deeply rooted in the culture to be removed. History continued to live through practice even when leaders tried to rewrite the narrative. People carried their traditions forward with their bodies, even when their scriptures pointed in another direction. And once you recognize that, you understand that the truth was never hidden. It was always right there, woven into the everyday actions of the believers, preserved not in books but in behavior. Once you see the roots, you see the tree differently. When you begin tracing the origins of any belief system, you are not attacking it. You are peeling back the layers to understand how it came to be. You are trying to see the world the people of that time saw, to understand the fears they carried, the traditions they inherited, and the meanings they created long before scripture ever appeared. And once you understand where a religion truly began, you start to understand why it looks the way it does today. Islam did not fall from the sky fully formed. It did not appear in a cultural vacuum. It grew from a landscape shaped by tribal gods and sacred stones, by rituals passed through generations, by lunar worship that defined the rhythm of time, and by myths that echoed across the desert long before the first recitation of the Quran. These elements were not erased, they were absorbed. They were given new language, new stories, new divine framing, but their structure remained the same. In that sense, Islam grew from humanity rather than from heaven. It rose from the soil of real people with real customs and real spiritual habits. And once you see that, once you understand that the heart of the religion is built from the world that existed before it, the spell begins to loosen. Not with anger, not with rebellion. It happens quietly. It happens slowly. It happens with clarity. It is similar to the shift described in Atheism is Rising, where belief does not collapse in an instant. It fades as understanding grows. It dissolves as you gain the courage to look directly at the foundations, instead of only the stories built on top of them. When the myths stop feeling like divine declarations and start feeling like human creations, something inside you awakens. You begin to see the tree differently because now you know the roots. So what does all this mean? It means that Islam, like every religion, is a human creation shaped by older human creations, a lineage of ideas passed from culture to culture, ritual to ritual, story to story. It means that the truth you were taught to fear questioning might not be as fragile as you once believed, because truth doesn't collapse when examined. Only illusion does. And if this exploration made you think, if it opened even one quiet question inside you, then keep going. Keep following the thread. Keep looking at history without fear. Keep choosing curiosity over obedience. Because the moment you stop accepting beliefs as sacred and start seeing them as stories, that's the moment you become free. If you value truth over tradition, clarity over comfort, and questioning over conformity, subscribe. There are more stories to uncover.